Hey guys, I'm Dr. Gonzalez, and today in this video we are going to talk about the following topics. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because in that way you will never miss a new video when I post it every single week. Alright, let's get started. First, we're going to start with an introduction of bone tissue. And we have to talk about, obviously, bones and cartilage, ligaments, and other connective tissue that it's part of the skeletal system. So let's begin with the skeletal system and its functions. In total, it has 6 important functions. The first one is that it provides support to the body. The second one is that it protects the internal organs like your brain, your heart, etc. It's going to assist with body movements in conjunction with your muscles. The fourth function is that it stores and releases calcium and also phosphorus. And in addition, it stores triglycerides in adipose cells inside an area that we call the yellow bone marrow. It also participates in the production of blood cells, particularly in the red bone marrow. And lastly, it has leverage or works as leverage because the skeleton can act as a lever for muscles. Alright, now let's talk about the structure of bones. So a long bone consists of several parts, and in this drawing that you see here, you can see them. We're going to start first with the diaphysis. The diaphysis is the bone shaft. Then we're going to go into the epiphysis, and there's 2 epiphyses, one on each end of the bone at the joints. So we're going to have this proximal epiphysis and this distal epiphysis in this example of the humerus, which is the bone that you have on your arm. And the reason we call it proximal is because this one is going to be obviously closer to the joint of the shoulder, for example, and the trunk of your body. And then the distal epiphysis because it's further away. This part would be, for example, where the elbow joint is located. And then, of course, we're going to have 2 metaphyses, which is the region between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. So this metaphysis is this area right here and also right here. Each bone, as you can see, it's also regular cartilage, right, which is this cartilage that you see on the borders. There's going to be one on each end. And there's also going to be other tissues on the bones, right? So your bones are going to be protected, for example, by a periosteum. Periosteum is this layer of tissue, is very thin connective tissue that surrounds the diaphysis, essentially. And then on the inside, there is an endosteum inside on the medullary cavity, which is a thin membrane lining the medullary cavity. And when I say medullary cavity, I refer to the hollow space within this diaphysis. In this picture of the humerus that we have as an example, we can also see part of the histology of the bone. For example, we can see the difference between compact bone versus spongy bone. So the main difference is that the compact bone is a dense and solid type of tissue of obviously bone tissue, and it's good at providing protection and support. And so the compact bone is going to form all the walls of these bones, for example, here in the humerus. Now, on the other hand, we have the spongy bone. Spongy bone is also known as the trabecular or cancellous bone, and it's very lightweight and it provides tissue support. It's typically located on the epiphysis of bones. And essentially, spongy bones forms the medullary or marrow cavity, which contains the bone marrow. In this case, it contains, for example, in adults, red bone marrow, which essentially red bone marrow, it's the area that forms your blood cells, mature and immature red blood cells, and white blood cells, as well as stem cells. And then in adults, we're also going to have another bone marrow, which is called the yellow bone marrow, located here at the medullary cavity. And it is essentially made up of adipocytes, or cells that contain fatty tissue. And now it's time for a short discussion break. So to summarize the portions of your bone or long bones, we already talked about the parts. For example, we mentioned the epiphysis, and remember we have two epiphyses, proximal and distal, and of course the diaphysis and metaphysis in between proximal epiphysis and diaphysis, or in between distal epiphysis and diaphysis. We also have, remember, the different types of bone marrow, like yellow bone marrow and red bone marrow within the spongy bone. And we have also that compact bone on the borders. And then, of course, we're going to have these layers of tissue protecting the bones, like the periosteum and endosteum. Now, I also have to talk about blood supply of the bone. So we have these periosteal arteries that are accompanied by nerves that enter the diaphysis through the Volkmann's canals, and they are accompanied by periosteal veins. So here we can see some examples of these blood vessels that I've mentioned. And essentially in the center, we're going to have a nutrient artery that enters the center of the diaphysis, in this case this one right here. And this is essentially an artery that will run alongside the nutrient vein, which exits via the same canal or nutrient foramen. The metaphysis and epiphysis also have their own arteries and veins called metaphyseal arteries and epiphyseal arteries and veins. Just FYI, I just want to give credit to the Visible Body AMP app, right? So these pictures that you're seeing right now, this is not my picture, it comes from this app. Okay, so now let's talk about part of the histology of bones. Particularly, we have to go over the 4 cell types that are inside your bones. So if we zoom in into your bones, we can see 4 major types. In this picture, we can see 3 of those types. So the first cell I just want to mention, it's called the Osteoprogenitor cells. And the Osteoprogenitor cells are bone stem cells that are able to differentiate into the other types of cells that you see here on the screen. So let me just type it in real quickly. Is osteo, as in bone, progenitor, as in creating something, and then of course the word cells. The second cell that we have to talk about is the osteoblasts, which are these ones right here. Osteoblasts typically will synthesize bone matrix, right? So they are called the bone building cells that secrete the bone matrix. In other words, these are naive cells, right? And eventually they will transform themselves into osteocytes when they basically after they put up that calcium, right? They put the calcium deposits, they trap themselves into that calcium deposit, and then they mature into osteocytes. So these osteocytes, like I said, is the mature bone cells, and they basically maintain the bone tissue structure. Last but not least, we have the osteoclasts, and these cells are very large cells that secrete enzymes to break down the bone matrix. And they essentially, what they do is essentially remodeling bones, and they cause them to release calcium. Lastly, we have to talk about where do these cells are located. So essentially, your compact bone tissue consists of structural units called osteons and or Harvesian systems, and they are essentially arranged in ways that allow them to resist torque. On the other part of the bones, we have that spongy bone tissue, which consists of a network of flat bone tissue pieces that we call trabeculae. And essentially, this is what you're seeing here, right? So this is the osteon that I was mentioning, and this is the trabeculae. And in there is where we can find the cells that we mentioned earlier. So for example, you can see where the osteocytes are located, right? You can see them right here. We have osteoclasts surrounding the borders of these trabeculae. We have osteoblasts also surrounding the borders of these trabeculae, for example. And then of course, if we look at the bone itself, right? If we look at the bone, right, and we zoom in, this is where these osteons and trabeculas are located, right? In a single piece of bone inside. So the compact bone, remember the compact bone, it's in the borders and it's made up by these osteons. And then of course the spongy bone, it's made up of these trabeculae. Earlier I did mention some of the blood vessels going through your bones. So they are located or going through these canals that are called perforating canals or the central canals, right? So the only difference is that some of these canals are vertical versus others that are horizontal. So that's the only difference, and these blood vessels are going to be located in there, as well as nerves and lymphatic vessels. Well, that's it for this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And if you have any comments or suggestions, you can feel free to leave them on the comment section below. And last but not least, if you like this t-shirt, it's now available on my Etsy shop at Queen Mary Anatomy. And by the way, I also have a blog post that you can check out if you need any tips or suggestions on how to study for your exams. Check it out. The link is right here. Right? Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.